Good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to see you all. Thank you for coming. Apologies for my appearance. I'm filming at the moment. There was nothing I could do about the hair. Thank you to Alexa, Arlene, Elle, and Anna for helping to organise this event. This conference call is to discuss the increasing digitalisation of children's lives and what, if anything, we can do about it. I first became interested in the topic of screens and children a few years ago when I was made patron of the education charity School Home Support. I visited schools up and down the country and often saw children distracted in classrooms, yet silent in playgrounds. Screens were taking their attention away from their teachers during lessons and away from each other during break time. I also observed children in general becoming a different species. The raucous exuberance of youth was being replaced with an anxious, irritable insularity that was disturbing to observe. I know personally that if I'd had devices in and out of the classroom, that I just wouldn't have done well academically. I'd have been distracted, I wouldn't have read books, and I'd have got up to God knows what on my various devices. I cherish the education I had, the connection with my beloved teachers, some of whom are still friends. It's been the greatest gift of my life, and I want all children to be able to focus, to acquire knowledge, and to achieve their maximum potential. Thanks to Jonathon's tireless work, the battle on the smartphone front is being waged with ever more credibility, fire and fury. The harms that a front-facing camera, addictive social media platforms and 24/7 dopamine ignition can do to a child are widely documented. From the damage to focus, to eyesight, to self-esteem, to deep thinking, to the ability to read books, to sleep well, to interact healthily in real life, to pure opportunity cost, the list is relentless. And these harms are at the more minor end of the spectrum. The self-harm, anorexia and suicide forums, the enhanced facility of knife crime organisation, the enticement to radicalisation and terrorism and the repulsively violent porn, these horrors are globally recognised and discussed now. Australia has manned up and banned social media for the under-16s. Let's hope the rest of us follow suit as a matter of urgency, in a fashion that protects children without impeding and controlling adults' freedoms. Damien McBeath, who is on today's call, told me last week that TeacherTapp has just published the research that 97% of teachers believe that social media is damaging their pupils. So all of you present today will hopefully be the leaders of a meaningful revolution in this country. However, the Emperor still seems to be wearing his new clothes in the realm of education. From the increasingly digital provision in kindergartens and nurseries seriously impacting toddler speech and development, to Atom Learning, Twinkle and YouTube running rife in our primary schools, to pretty much constant screen use in many of our secondary schools, we seem to be sleepwalking into a world where screens are replacing books. It's wholly understandable. These products seemed futuristically exciting at the beginning. Well-intentioned schools spent fortunes buying and implementing the latest software and platforms and trained their teachers in how to use it. It was generous and it was well meant. But now we have new information and many believe we must press pause. Information is clinically proven to be more profoundly absorbed and understood from a page in a book than it is from a screen. And handwriting implements that information into the brain more effectively than typing does. Reading books and handwriting work is therefore a deeper, not to mention a calmer, way to learn. Health professionals for safer screens, all qualified and experienced NHS clinicians, have recently issued guidelines stating that 11 to 17-year-olds should have no more than 1 to 2 hours screen time per day. This includes everything: iPads, school laptops, smartphones. It's all just screen time to the brain. All this emerging research must generate concerted moderation in the educational sphere, rather than the open-armed embrace we're seeing here in Britain. There's currently talk of AI being pumped into our classrooms, with children's data being harvested to better improve the AI. Why? I've spoken to teachers in state schools who've admitted that classroom tech has hampered the progress of many of their pupils, and the huge boom in tutoring among private school children points to the fact that they're not learning well in school either. There's even no consensus that interactive smartboards are safe. They're insanely bright, they're radiation emitting, and they're simply not as effective as a teacher writing out what is in that second being explained on a black or white board. But edtech companies are relentlessly flogging their wares to schools, very successfully too. The business of edtech is now worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Teachers are having to submit to the new normal, and exam boards in this country are threatening to go online for all subjects. Where is all this coming from? If, like social media, it's not in fact in the best interests of the children, but of the people who make the products, isn't it time to step back right now? We have a couple of special guests on our call. Lotta Edholm, who did just that with schools in Sweden, along with her Minister of Education, Johan Pehrson. You're very welcome. I look forward to hearing from you both later. John, I know you don't let your graduate students have laptops or iPads in your lectures because you view them as distraction machines. And Hugh and Anna, we got in touch through our mutual unhappiness with the increasingly digital nature of our children's London education. We are grateful that our children's schools are now open to a review of their EdTech provision, specifically looking at the disadvantages of individual pupil devices and screen-based homework. The standard defenses of convenience and having to be au fait with the modern world are crumbling. Digital literacy can be taught in IT lessons. Digital dependency transpires when screens contaminate every subject, even the humanities. Simple questions such as, why is cutting and pasting some information from Google into a PowerPoint superior to reading a passage in a well-researched textbook and handwriting a response to it? Why is homework listed on Teams better than jotted down in a paper homework diary? Why is digitally transporting a child to the Egyptian pyramids better than him or her imagining it? This kind of jazz hands immersion as an engagement tool doesn't seem to work. It negates the need to imagine or to wonder, and it renders the pupil a passive rather than an active learner. Considering also that blue light from screens damages children's eyesight, disturbs their hormones and their sleep rhythms, plus the devices themselves are sources of constant distraction, surely it makes sense for our under 18s to use them as little as possible. It's all very well to get tough on smartphones, but when children are working and learning less well on their school devices, it's clear the conversation needs to happen right now. I'm delighted to hand over to the most hailed voice in the world on the topic of screens and children, social psychologist and best-selling author of The Anxious Generation, Jonathon Haidt.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Sophie, for that. That was an amazing introduction with so many powerful images, especially seeing our children become like a different species. I think there is a sense in which that is happening, and that really we've got to understand it and then stop it. So I'd like to start by talking briefly about two loves. One is my love for teachers. My mother was a second grade teacher. I am a teacher of sorts at the university level. And I actually dedicated the book to all of the teachers of my children here in New York City. The second love is for Great Britain. My parents were real Anglophiles, and like many, well, being Jewish of Eastern European origin, my mother often said, "Thank God America was settled by Britain rather than by Spain, France, or any other country." There's something amazing about British institutions and British traditions and the British Enlightenment, the British intellectual tradition that is just uniquely suited to make great modern liberal democracies, I believe. And while I have such pleasure and pride in being part of the Anglosphere, what I've been seeing over the last 10 or so years is that all of the Anglosphere nations are going through the same thing at the same time, the same problems in our universities, some similar problems in our politics. We are all linked together in ways that mean that we can really learn from each other, we can help each other. And whatever happens internationally, whatever trade wars my president declares, please know that we Americans love you Brits. So when Sophie and Hugh and Anna and Arlene came to me and were asking me if I could give a talk at schools, and we came up with this idea, I just really jumped at the chance because I would love, if I can help British teachers and British schools, I'm very happy to do that. So let's go. I have a talk which I hope will really lay things out for you and set us up for discussion. So I'm going to share my screen and share desktop 2. Share this should work. And let's see, oops, hold on a second. Okay. Oh, no, not that. Hold on a second. PowerPoint, green button. Okay. Oh yes, I can see. Sophie, just give me a thumbs up if you see my first slide clearly. Do you all see the first slide clearly? Very good. Okay, let's go. All right, so rolling back the phone-based childhood and the screen-based school day. Now, to really understand what has happened, to our kids since about 2010. I want you to think about neurons growing. Our children's brains are developing rapidly, they're rewiring rapidly. And a good metaphor for neurons growing is tree roots growing. And so here you can see a photo in which this tree's roots spread out and clearly guided by where water was available, they took this shape around those tiles. Trees are really amazing things. They grow so slowly, but you can see the results. Here's a tree that was rubbing up against an old Civil War era tombstone, and it ended up growing around the tombstone. Now, this is, I think, a good metaphor for many things about human growth. So recently, there was a big panic, a big little panic, over what's called phone pinky. So half of American teens say that they are online almost all the time, almost constantly. They're holding the phone in the left hand almost constantly, and some believe that their left pinky is now very different from their right pinky. Their left pinky has, in a sense, grown around the phone because the phone is always in the left hand. Now, whether or not that holds up as a real medical problem, these things do hold up as medical problems. We're all spending so much time hunched over that it's leading to increases in neck pain, back pain, wrist pain, things like that. We also know that smartphones are changing the shape of humanity's eyeballs all around the world. Myopia is growing because children are spending so much time looking at screens close up. And children with myopia, it's been found, spend twice as much time on their screens as kids without myopia. So what we have is a global epidemic in which human eyeballs are becoming elongated, which means short-sighted. The focus point of light is no longer on the retina because we're not letting it, our kids are spending so much time on screens instead of outside where we evolved to develop. And so my argument to you today is that since 2010 or so, the human brain has been growing around smartphones in very much the same way that this tree grew around this tombstone. The story that I tell in The Anxious Generation is very simple. It's a tragedy in two acts. In Act One, we lost the play-based childhood. Between 1990 and 2010, we stopped letting our kids out. Now, this was true in America, where we had a lot of crime. It turns out it was also true in Canada and Britain, even though you didn't have the crazy crime levels that we had in the United States at that time. Now, there's some places like Sweden, Scandinavia, Germany, where they still do let their kids out, and we'll come back to that. But in the Anglo countries, we gradually ended the play-based childhood. And then all of a sudden, between 2010 and 2015, technological changes and market changes meant that the phone-based childhood came storming in, and it really took over in the space of 5 years, 2010 to 2015. I can summarize the book by saying that we have overprotected our children in the real world and underprotected them online. I'm going to make 5 points, and they will tell a story that will lead up to what I hope you will consider doing. I'll give you sort of the big picture of what I think needs to be done, and then I hope in the discussion we'll talk about the implementation. I'm sure there are 1,000 obstacles, problems, conflicting demands that are going to make reform difficult, but I think you'll see we have to do it. Reform is urgent. So let's begin. The global decline in education. About a year ago, Derek Thompson wrote an article in The Atlantic titled, "It Sure Looks Like Phones Are Making Students Dumber." And there are multiple data sets that show this. In the United States, we have what's called the Nation's Report Card, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. What you can see is that in reading and mathematics, we made slow but very steady progress from 1971 through 2012. Even though there were all kinds of demographic headwinds, decline of marriage, all kinds of other problems, even still, we spent a lot of money on education, and we made some slow progress until 2012, and then things turned around. Now, everybody freaked out when they saw these results a year ago because they said, look what COVID did, look what COVID did. But nobody seemed to comment on the fact that 50 years of improvement turned around in 2012, not in 2020. Now, some people said, well, but it's mostly COVID. It's mostly COVID. So as we leave COVID behind, there should be some recovery, some experts said. But this just came in a week ago. Last week, we got the 2024 data from America's Report Card. And guess what happened? the decline continues in both reading and mathematics. And I want to show you something important. And I've seen this in many data sets. Whatever is happening since 2012, it is hurting the kids at the bottom the most. The decline in education in this graph is driven especially by the kids in the bottom quartile of educational results. Now, that bottom quartile also it overlaps or is disproportionately low SES. It's in America, it's disproportionately Black and Hispanic. It's disproportionately kids with single parents who just don't have the resources and who end up giving their kids phones to spend all day on their phones. So whatever it is that we're doing, which is harming education, it always hits the bottom quarter harder than the top quarter. And it's not just us. It's not just the US. It's happening around the world. So you all know about PISA, the Program for International Scholastic Assessment. And here you can see, once again, the scores were fairly stable from 2000 to 2010. And then look what happens. I've broken this up by region in the world. All over the world, test scores are dropping. And it's not just that they're doing worse on the tests. Jean Twenge and I found some items, interesting items, buried in the PISA study. It's all about academic achievement. But there are 6 items about how you feel at school. Things like, I often feel lonely at school, or I make friends easily, which is reverse scored. And what we find is that these sorts of loneliness at school, so let's call it school alienation, those levels were very stable from 2000 to 2012. But in a pattern that will be very, very familiar, after 2012, all over the world, kids feel lonelier in school. Of course they do. Everyone's on their phone all day long. There's not as much talking, playing, laughter, joking, touching. So this isn't just about academic performance. I probably don't need to give you all this data. You're working in schools. I'm sure you've seen it. What the phones and the technology does to kids' attention. So the Wall Street Journal had a big article on a teacher in Pennsylvania who tried everything to get his kids off the phones to break the addiction and get them learning again. And at one point, he instituted, or he tried to get them to do a detox to really get off their phones for a while. And and it worked really well. Before the detox, Isabel Ritchie, a senior in his class, was spending 6 hours a day on her phone, most of it watching TikTok. I would go on my phone at the beginning of every class and never get off. Can you imagine that? Students come into class and they watch TikTok all day long. Of course, scores are going down around the world. Isabel Ritchie is now down to about 1 hour a day, and she's read 9 novels since starting the detox, and she's been doing her homework in long chunks. So these digital devices are just decimating kids' attention in school and at home. Of course, scores are going down around the world. So that's my point about the global decline in education. Humanity is less educated now, and I believe it's in large part because of the devices, the educational technology and the personal cell phones. But it's not just education. In The Anxious Generation, I focused on mental health, so these stats will be familiar to anyone who read the book, but I'll show them here, some graphs that were not in the book. So I first noticed this as a college professor in 2015. This graph shows various disabilities from American college students. In 2012, they were all millennials. But then as we go on past 2012, Gen Z begins coming in. And the big difference is that Gen Z has very high levels of psychological disorders, much, much higher than the millennials. It's not all disorders. This is also U.S. college data aggregated across hundreds of universities. And what we see, the familiar pattern, no change before 2010, and then this happens. Rates of anxiety and depression skyrocket and are now normal. It is now normal for an American teenager, especially a girl, to be sad, to be thinking about suicide, and to meet criteria for a major depression. It is normal. It's not a majority, but we're in the realm of 30 to 40% of our girls, especially, are now really suffering. And it's not that everybody is feeling this way. Yes, the world is in a sorry state right now, but in the 2010s, it was really just Gen Z that went up. So whatever is happening, it's hitting people born after 1995. And it hits girls especially hard. This is no longer college data. This is nationally representative data from all teenagers. And what we see, actually, the percentage increase is actually often in the same ballpark. But because girls start with higher levels, the absolute increase is enormous. And again, it is now normal for an American teenage girl to be suffering from major depression. It is just common and normal. Oh, and you can see the effect of COVID there. It was a blip. Whatever is happening to our kids, it's not because of COVID. Um, Now, some people say, oh, come on, this is just, Gen Z is so comfortable talking about it. It's just changing diagnostic criteria. They're lowering the bar. No. If that was true, then we wouldn't see the same thing in objectively measured behavior, but we do. So this is the number per 100,000 of American preteens, age 10 to 14, who are, these are emergency room visits, actually, for non-fatal self-harm, which is mostly cutting. And this is what happens. It was stable before 2010, and then it goes way, way up. It's nearly tripled for our preteen girls. And tragically, we see the same thing for suicide. Now, the rates for 10 to 14-year-olds are very, very low. And this is what they were before 2010. And then they go up for boys and for girls. Now, it's quite shocking. This increase here, a 67% increase in suicides in the United States in a single year, 2012 to 2013. And it wasn't a blip. It was the beginning of a rise to 134% increase. So we're seeing it in behavior. And as I said, it's the entire Anglosphere. We're all going through the same thing at the same time. These same patterns, I have some graphs in the book. There's a lot more graphs at the website, anxiousgeneration.com. It's happening in Canada, Australia, New Zealand. It's happening very clearly in Scandinavia and Northern Europe. It's not much in Eastern Europe. There are some interesting differences that we can talk about based on degrees of community and religion, I believe. But in the countries that are the freest, that give kids a lot of freedom, we find those kids got washed away beginning around 2012. So here's similar data from Britain on self-harm rates. These are based on examination of medical records. Your rates of self-harm per 100,000 in the population were stable before 2010. And then this happens, a very sudden, very sharp increase in girls cutting and harming themselves and also taking overdoses of psychiatric medications. We see the same sort of pattern in Australia, no change in the early period, and then it goes up for girls and for boys. And I could show you the same graphs in New Zealand, Canada, et cetera. So we have a global mystery. Since the early 2010s, young people across the developed world are becoming more anxious, depressed, and lonely, more likely to harm and kill themselves, less educated, less able to focus, basically less intelligent in terms of functional applied intelligence. Why? Why is this happening in this way in so many countries at the same time? There's only one theory that has been offered. I have not even encountered a theory, an alternative. Lots of people try to explain to me something in the United States. Oh, we had a terrible school shooting in 2012, and that led to these really over-the-top, scary lockdown drills in 2013. Yeah, sure. But why did girls in Iceland and New Zealand start checking into psychiatric emergency wards? It doesn't make any sense. So the only theory that has even been proposed is this one, the great rewiring of childhood. So that's the adolescent mental health crisis. Now, let me step back and explain exactly how this happened and how did it happen so quickly. And I think this is the explanation. So suppose that you were born, suppose you were born in 1995, which is the last year of the millennial generation. So in 2010, you are 15 years old. In 2010, the iPhone is out, but very few teens have one. Teens are still on flip phones and basic phones like that. And so you use your basic phone. It has no front-facing camera, no internet, no Instagram. You text people, you call people, not strangers, just friends and family, and that's basically it. And so that's what the millennials went through puberty on. That's the technology that they used. But in very short order, by 2015, flip phones were gone. Everyone had an iPhone. And an iPhone, I mean, yes, you can use it as a phone, but very few people do. It is overwhelmingly a supercomputer that allows the entire world to reach your children, strangers who want sex or money from them, advertisers, companies that want to addict them. The technology changed in an eye blink, and so did childhood. Our children are now the product in the attention economy. Think about it. How much have you ever given to Facebook or TikTok? How many dollars? How about your kids? How much money have they given? Zero? Yeah, me too. So how are these companies worth trillions of dollars? Because they've monetized all of our kids' attention. So it isn't just about the technology. It's also about the freedom to play, to have adventure, and to take risk. So, images of 20th century childhood. The top one, I believe, is from Britain. The bottom one, in America in the 1980s, it was just very common. If you'd biking around with your friends, you find an extraterrestrial, you put them in your bike basket, you have some fun. I mean, we could just do those things back in the 1980s. But now childhood is this. And especially if you're a boy, you can't go over to your friend's house if you want to play. You have to go to your house where you have your controller, your screen, your headset, and then you can play multiplayer video games. So our kids are lonely. The more connected they are electronically, the lonelier they are. You can also see the great rewiring of childhood in this single graph. This is the number of minutes per day that various age groups spend with their friends. And it used to be 120 minutes a day, 2 hours a day, young people, 15 to 24 in this sample, spent with their friends. And all the older groups, they're married, they've got kids, they're not hanging out with their friends. But young people used to hang out with friends. And then what happens? Everyone gets a smartphone, and this happens. And I want to note that the 2019 data collection was before anyone knew what COVID was. And the 2020 data collection was in May during the height of the lockdowns. And look closely at that line. Do you see the COVID effect? Do you see how COVID accelerated the decline? I don't, because it didn't accelerate the decline. Gen Z began socially distancing the day they got their iPhones. They were almost done by 2019. COVID lockdowns just said, hey, finish the job. Here's data from Britain, same sort of thing. From 1975 to 2015, data was collected at three time points. And what you see is that outdoor play at the bottom has dropped 30%, while screen-based activities are up 20%. So this is happening across the Anglosphere. Our kids are growing up on screens, not playing with each other. And of course, even in that time use study, the time that where they're with friends, they're often just each on their individual phones. So even that doesn't really count as time with friends. And we start them very early and we hyperstimulate them. The boys especially. Boys really, I'll come back to dopamine in a minute, but look at this boy. His father put this up on TikTok. He was so proud of the kid. Look how fast the kid is. Imagine that kid's brain growing. Imagine those neurons feeling their way out to try to figure out where are we supposed to go. And this kid is getting hyperstimulated for hours a day, every day for 20 years. We found that the phone is an effective way to occupy our kids, to let us do our adult things. If you're trying to coach your son's soccer practice and your daughter is there, just give her your phone. She'll be fine for an hour, and you can coach your son's soccer practice. And our kids want to be just like us, so we now make toy iPhones so they can get practice even before they can walk. Now, in the book, I go through, there are so many harms. I don't have time on this call to list them all. It's not just about mental illness. In fact, most of the harm, I believe, is actually the attention fragmentation is probably going to turn out to be the greatest cost to humanity, even more than the mental illness and the suicide. So I have a chapter where I list these basic fundamental harms that hit boys and girls equally, that are all very serious. There's a whole chapter in the book on why social media is so particularly harmful to girls: visual social comparison, perfectionism, relational aggression. Social media is just tailor-made to take all the worst parts of being a 12-year-old girl and crank them up tenfold. And there is a whole chapter on the story for boys, the basic story, because at first I was a little confused. I could see the clear evidence of harm from social media to girls, and that evidence was not so clear for social media and boys. But gradually I learned in working on the book, Zach Rausch and we drew on our friend Richard Reeves, who has a wonderful book called Of Boys and Men. And the story is that boys began retreating from the real world in the 1970s when computers came in, video games, boys were drawn to computers more early on. And every year, the virtual world was more and more welcoming, while the physical world was often less welcoming. Schools really shifted to be conducive to girls' education. In America, we shortened recess, we cut shop class, anything hands-on, we cut. Anything with any risk, we cut. It's all sitting in your seat learning math and English and science. And so boys have been declining relative to girls since the 70s. But that's okay, because the virtual world is just getting better and better. And the thing to keep your eye on with boys is dopamine. Boys will seek out quick dopamine hits even more than girls will. And then when you take away the device, and many of us have seen this, you take away the video game, you say, no, you can't play it anymore. They don't just say, oh, I really want to. They can get very, very upset because their brain is now, the dopamine circuits are now screaming out. They're completely unsatisfied. So we have to really keep our eye on dopamine for boys. So that's my explanation for how it happened so amazingly quickly. 2010, no sign of a problem. 2015, international mental health crisis. Now let's turn to ed tech. As you know, there's enormous progress in getting phones out of schools. It's happening at lightning speed. More than a dozen states in the U.S. have already done it. Dozens more are planning on doing it. I know there's many schools in the UK have done it. I hope to God you will all do it by next September. Kids with phones in school means that kids are not learning very much or interacting with each other. So we got to get the phones out. But then what I hear is parents and teachers tell me, great, it's so much better. We got the phones out. But actually, a lot of our kids, they're still just watching TikTok and YouTube on their iPads and Chromebooks that we gave them. So what do? Well, what can we say about educational technology? So first, I want to level set. And as Sophie said, I don't let my students, I teach at New York University. I teach a graduate course and an undergraduate course. The graduate students are mostly 26 to 30 years old. And at the bottom is what I did for 10 years. I like to use a computer to take notes. And so I would let my students use their computers, but I made them literally, you have to stand up, hold up your right hand, and you have to repeat out loud in unison. I pledge that I will only use a device or look at a screen during class time when it is specifically for this class. So I would make them do that. And then I'd say, okay, now you can use your laptops. And the TA would sit in the back of the room and she would tell me they can't do it. They're online shopping, they're texting, they're checking their LinkedIn, they're watching videos. 28-year-old business students who are paying a lot of money for a graduate degree can't pay attention if there's a screen in front of them. And then, of course, that distracts also anyone else who can see the screen. So this is my new policy. None, absolutely none, nothing, no phones, nothing. In theory, if someone needs an accommodation for an educational or health reason, absolutely fine. But in the 4 years I've had this policy, no one's ever even asked for it. And guess what? They love it. I asked them at the end of the semester, do you prefer this policy or would you prefer to have had your screens? It's almost unanimous every year. This is so much better. So we're talking about people in their 20s here. How do you suppose it is for a 9-year-old? In the early 2010s, Google in particular flooded American schools. They had a different business model. They weren't making money selling the computers. They were making money selling the services. So they could do cut rate pricing, give them away. And as you see in this graph, between 2012 and 2016, Google took over American education. I don't know if it's the same in Britain. And during this time, it was very exciting. It was a gold rush for the companies, but it was spurred on by this misapplied notion of equity. We thought, well, rich kids have computers, poor kids are less likely to. Let's give everyone a computer. And philanthropists and Bill Gates and put up a lot of money so that every kid could have a one-to-one. That was the dream, a one-to-one laptop. Every kid must have a laptop on their desk. And this is going to boost student scores, researchers find. So that all looks great. And then COVID comes along and we double down that, we've really got to get everybody their own laptop. But then why is it that exactly as this was happening, scores were plummeting, not just in America, but around the world? And the explanation, in part, is that they tricked us. Sure, they showed us some studies, but guess what? They did the studies, or they paid for them. So the studies were cooked. The evidence for benefits was never very strong. It was dishonest, a lot of it. And the UNESCO put out a major report a year and a half ago on technology and education, and they reviewed all the studies they could find on the role of technology in education. And guess what they conclude? Student use of devices beyond a moderate threshold may have a negative impact on academic performance. The use of smartphones and computers disrupts classroom and home learning activity, and they say that the decline is mostly linked to increased distraction and time spent on non-academic activities. If kids are watching TikTok all day long, of course they're not learning. They also note that excessive use of digital devices has potential harmful effects on physical and mental health. So we're making our kids less educated, lonelier, and more mentally ill by cramming technology down their throats and putting screens in front of their faces all day long. And again, we're mostly harming the most vulnerable students. There is a moral imperative, I think, to act and act quickly. Now, finally, as COVID recedes and as schools examine the damage, now we're seeing finally the pushback. And Sweden, God bless them, they're, the Scandinavians are amazing. Like if there's a problem, they'll get a group together, they'll study it, and then they'll come up with a policy, and then they'll implement the policy. And as an American, I'm like, wow, how do you do that? Like we can never do that in my country. But in Sweden, they've looked at the data and they've decided, you know what, it was a mistake, and they're rolling it back. They're switching off. They're returning to more traditional ways. There's clear scientific evidence that digital tools impair rather than enhance student learning. I just want to share with you one other study, which I think is very revealing. I'm putting together a Google Doc, which I'll tell you about in a moment, that aggregates all the studies we can find. And this one is very interesting, a survey of hundreds of teachers, principals, and district leaders. The question is, in my opinion, experience, when the amount of screen time increases, student behavior typically gets much worse. 35% said much worse. A little worse. 45% said it gets a little worse, which means that 80% say that increasing screen time makes student behavior worse. Only 7% say it makes behavior better. And I think the overarching reason for them, there are many reasons. The distraction is a big part of it. But what I'm coming to see more and more is that if you keep your eye on dopamine, you'll see just how devastating ed tech is. This is a wonderful book called Dopamine Nation by Anna Lemke. She's a professor and doctor at Stanford. And after reading her book and applying it here, I came up with this little haiku or koan or whatever you want to say. If you gamify 1/4 of a child's school day with screen-based rewards, which give quick dopamine, then you will get more engagement during that part of the day. And you might even publish studies saying, look, our app increased engagement. Maybe it even increased math learning. But the child's dopamine neurons will habituate to that stimulation, and they will become less responsive to external stimulation. They will need more stimulation in order to pay attention, which means that the child will find the non-screen parts of the day painfully boring. And this might explain why the more ed tech we put in, the worse our students do. So what should school leaders do now? And I give my answer in two parts. The first is the 4 norms that I'm urging everyone to do, and these are happening around the world. People are doing it. It's really exciting. 4 simple norms. We break the collective action problem. We're all giving our kids screens because they say everyone else has it. I don't want to be the only one who's not on Instagram, Snapchat, whatever. So I'll just go through them very briefly, the 4 norms. The first is no smartphone before high school. Just give a basic phone, this cartoon from the New Yorker. It's been so nice getting to interact with you for these past 6 years. Here's your first device. As Sophie said, we see them slipping away. We see them almost becoming different creatures once we give them a phone and it moves to the center of their lives. Norm number 2, no social media before 16. Social media is wildly inappropriate for children. It was engineered to be addicted. They knew what they were doing. They studied dopamine. They studied brain development, and they did everything they could to hook children, and it worked. So we can't resist. Our kids can't resist. We need laws to raise the age, as Australia has done, as Australia has manned up, as Sophie said. The third is phone-free schools, and all of you need to do this as soon as you possibly can if you haven't done it yet. Because if anyone is able to text or post during class or during the school day, then everyone has to check because no one wants to be the only kid who doesn't know about the thing that just happened. And so I just want to make a major point about phone-free schools. What a lot of states and schools are doing in the US is they're banning phone use just during class time. And this is a huge mistake. Here's why. So a big report from a big survey from the National Education Association in the USA. They asked teachers, how disruptive is student use of cell phones during instructional time for you? And then they divided it up based on what the school's policy was. So there are 2 really bad policies. Oh, we let the teacher set the rule. Oh, each teacher can do what they want. That's a terrible, terrible policy. And teachers in those schools, 79% say, yeah, it's disruptive. We're having a problem with phones. But guess what? Banning schools that ban phones during class but let students use them between classes, it's just as bad. Why? Because the students are totally in the drama of the online world when they come to class. And even if you collect the phone and put it in a little phone, like shoe pouch at the front of the room, their brain is still on the drama of what's been going on. It takes a while for them to forget that and begin to focus on teachers and students. So banning cell phone use only during school or during class time is a terrible mistake. Some schools say it makes things a little better, but the only policy that really works is this one. In schools where the students store the phone, they come into school, they put it. You could just put it in a padded envelope in a box at the front of their homeroom, at the front of their first period class, or you can use a yonder pouch. But schools with these policies, only 28% of the teachers say that phones are disrupting their teaching. So this is the policy that you have to do. This is the one that works. There are some objections before it goes into place, but within a month, even the students generally love it because they see, you know what? School's a lot more fun now that we're talking to each other. And norm number 4, far more independence, free play, and responsibility in the real world. And this is, please go to letgrow.org, an organization I co-founded to help schools and parents give their kids more independence. I just want to point out that this same problem of locking up our kids, not trusting them, you have it in the UK too. This study came out a year or two ago, or a couple of years ago. Children are not getting enough opportunities to develop their ability to assess and manage risk. If children are getting less time to play outdoors in an adventurous way, this may have an impact on their mental health and overall well-being. Human children are mammals and they need to play. They need to engage in risky play. Risk is a feature, not a bug. And a few years ago, actually, this was like 6 years ago now. So you're much more aware of this, in part because you have so many fewer lawyers than we do. Your schools can let kids take risk. I mean, just look at this kid. He's about to learn the principle of Archimedes in a way that he may never forget unless he gets a concussion. But the point is that when you let kids take risks, they occasionally get hurt a little bit, but the benefit to their mental health and their confidence is enormous, and it's worth the risk of some bruises. So that's the 4 norms. Everyone should be doing that. That's sweeping the world. But now let's talk about EdTech, which I've only begun to learn about more recently. And so the 5th norm that I want to propose for school leaders and teachers is simple. Just delay and reduce EdTech. And most importantly, no one-to-one laptops or tablets. That was a disastrous policy. And so if you go to anxiousgeneration.com/reviews, my team and I were putting together, we have all these Google Docs, we collect all the information, we sort it. As you can see here in the table of contents, we're sorting the studies by question. How do personal digital devices impact learning? How does EdTech impact cognitive development? So we're organizing all the results. I don't want to be saying publicly that we need to get rid of things unless there's good evidence. But I'm telling you because this is what it's turning into. We're working on this. We'll have a version of it up within a week or two. We'll send you all a link. We'll send everybody a link on an email after the call. But based on what we're learning and based on what I've already told you, I think we can make these recommendations. First, it's clear that EdTech has been foisted upon us with little evidence of benefit driven by market forces and wishful thinking. Second, there is increasing evidence of harm. And what that means is that the only proper stance towards technology in the classroom has to be skepticism. We have to assume that all of these things are guilty until proven innocent. Scores are going down around the world. Mental illness is going up around the world. We need to be much more careful with our children's brains than we have been. And also, the amount of money being spent on all this stuff, it would make a difference if we spent it elsewhere. So we should probably spend it elsewhere, unless there's clear evidence that something will help. More specifically, the principle should be delay. We know that kids are most vulnerable in the early years, the first 4 or 5 years. And actually, puberty is the second period of second most vulnerability because the brain is rewiring very rapidly. But the point is, let kids get through early puberty at least. Try to keep this stuff as far away from kids as possible, at least until age 14 or 15. You know, in secondary education, I understand there may be more needs for technology, but for younger kids, just try to delay it as long as possible. You can certainly have a computer classroom. They can learn to program. They can go into a special room and use computers, no problem. But you don't want it constantly pulling at their attention. And the second rule is reduce. Whatever we're doing too much of it. And again, that word that they used in the UNESCO report, beyond a moderate level, heavy use seems to be clearly harmful. So reduce. And a third principle here is align. The research we're reading does seem to say that sometimes there's a very specific pedagogical reason for using a very specific program, and those sometimes do show benefits. So I'm not saying it's all garbage. If everything is aligned, the technology, the need, and the child and the lesson are all aligned, there can be benefits. But for the most part, we've been throwing technology at kids, putting everything online, and most of it has been counterproductive. So that's my point about the fifth norm, and that's my story. So to conclude, it sure looks like phones are making students dumber and lonelier and more mentally ill. So we've got to stop. You can find many more resources if you go to anxiousgeneration.com and then click on the Take Action button, and you'll see a whole set of resources for educators and schools. We have a lot of materials there. I hope you'll browse the site. And then also, I hope you'll all sign up for my free Substack. Go to afterbabel.com. This is where we're publishing our ongoing research. And you can see we have a whole subcategory for what schools and educators can do now. And we have several articles on EdTech and the problems with EdTech. So that's my talk to you. We've got to roll back the phone-based childhood. We've got to roll back the screen-based school day. And now I look forward to talking with you and figuring out how we can all work together and how you can all help each other. There is incredible power in numbers, and if you do reforms together on a large scale, the whole country is going to say, "Wow, look what the schools are doing," and then the rest of them are going to do it too. All right, let's talk. Sophie, back to you. I think it's back to Sophia.
Actually, I'll chime in there. Thank you, John.
Oh, Alexa.
So what we'll do next, everyone, is Q&A. So this is time for any questions that you have for John in particular. How you can do this is you can submit them to me in the chat. We have nearly 300 people on this Zoom, so we will not get to all of your questions, but I'll choose a few and I'll call on you. Before we get to that, and while you're thinking through your questions and submitting them, I'll pass the floor to Hugh.
Yes.
Hugh, you can come on off mute.
Hello. Am I speaking? Can you hear me?
You're all good.
Hear you and see you.
Yes, great. Hi. Well, look, first of all, John, that's unbelievably kind of you to do this for us, the Brits. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, you and your team. As far as I'm concerned, you are the great hero in the vanguard of this fight back against a massive, perhaps the biggest industry, the most powerful industry in the world, which has set its sights on destroying our children's childhood. And I regard you as a hero. People may be wondering on this, and thank you, by the way, everyone who's turned up to be on this. They may be wondering what I'm doing here with my wife. The answer is I come from two places here. One is I'm the son of a teacher. My mother taught for 30 years in the state school system. I'm interested in teachers. I'm extremely sympathetic to teachers. I watched her go through hell, especially, I mean, in every sense, I can see it's a really, really tough job. And I regard what they do, what teachers do, as heroic, to use that word again. So the last thing this webinar is entitled, is supposed to be, is some kind of teaching teachers to suck eggs or bashing teachers. Teachers are great. But the other reason that my wife and I, that's Anna, who's somewhat one of these many screens, are on this, is simply watching our children suffer horribly. And it's been very, very depressing watching big tech kidnap their lives, and to see children really finding it very, very difficult to get properly interested in anything that isn't a screen, swarming like blue bottles around any screen that appears in the room instantly and tragically. Or if you take them on some fun outing, you know, within 6 minutes, and I'm sure a lot of the people on this webinar have had the same experience who have kids, you know, 20 minutes in, 45 minutes in, can we go home now? Can we go home now? Can we go home now? Because they're so desperate to get back to a screen. And the exhausting nature of parenthood under these circumstances, year after year, month after month, day after day, fighting the children. No, 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 give that back. Or no, we agreed you could have 20 minutes on Saturday and you've had half an hour. On and on. Why are you going to see Tommy and not Johnny? It's because we know Tommy's allowed endless screen time, and it's shattering. And so it was extremely surprising and extremely depressing when you get emails from the school about, or the new school you've sent your kid to, saying proudly, and we give all our children their own Chromebook or their own iPad. And you just think, what? How could that be a good idea? If school is for anything, it's surely they deserve just 6 hours off from their addiction, from this crazy addiction. Because to people like us, honestly, big tech, with its extraordinary powers, seems like a drug cartel pushing its wares at children. And it seems to me that way too many schools, instead of calling the police, are saying to the drug cartels waiting outside the school gate, would you like some tea? Would you like some biscuits? How can we help you? And it's wrong. It has to be wrong. So I'm very, very grateful for John for speaking there, and for everyone for turning up. And I'm going to be very interested to hear what some of you on this webinar from the teacher community have to say. So yes, Q&A time. Maybe I'll kick it off to get the ball rolling. John, you know, when I have this fight with schools, they often say, yes, but these screens have restrictions. We've got wonderful software. The kids can only do their schoolwork. They can't do other stuff. And, you know, what we've found anecdotally is that the number one task of a child now, a school child, is to get together with other kids, either in real life or online, to work out how to get around those restrictions. And they are absolutely brilliant at it. And we know anecdotally lots of stories about, oh yeah, I'm on YouTube during my lesson. I'm doing games during my lesson. All the things that are supposed to be banned. Would you say that's true? That just purely in terms of the technology, it is not possible to restrict what an online device can do?
I think that is absolutely correct. When we give kids these multifunction devices that can do 1,000 different things, the kids are not going to do the one thing that we want. You can put on the restrictions, but then you have an eternal cat and mouse game. And it's the same one that we play at home. And this is why the standard advice that all the experts have been giving for 10 years is, well, talk to your child, figure out, you know, which apps are good for them, what time limits, and it doesn't work. Like, no one's having luck with that for that reason. Once kids are addicted and they're clever and they're cooperating online, they're going to be devoted to finding ways around it. For example, one school that I heard of, they had all these restrictions on what sites you can visit, but it turns out when you take your Chromebook home, you can get on the site at home, and then when you come to school, you can stay on the site. The school just blocks you getting onto it, but doesn't care if you're already on it. So what you said is absolutely right. And that's why we need simple rules, like no one-to-one devices, delay. And I don't know how things are. I guess you have your primary school goes up to around age 11 or 12, I think it is. So I hope it'd be reasonable to really make that a marker, like at least clear this all out of primary school. As I said, I don't let my grad students use them in school, so we should get rid of it in secondary schools as well. But let's at least start with the primary school. So you're absolutely right. It's a losing game.
And can I ask, because this is something I'm very unclear on, I don't know if you have the answer. I sometimes suspect, because I ask schools, you know, how much did you spend on these devices for a start? And they say, oh no, we got a very good deal. Or we leased them on a very good deal. And I'm asking myself, what's the motive for the tech company in giving them a very good deal? Is it like in the old days, the high street banks in this country were very keen to get you early, because once they've got you
Exactly.
forever? Is it something like that that's going on?
Absolutely, that's right. It's two things. It's primarily that. And so, you know, there's the Apple ecosystem versus the Google ecosystem, and those two are battling it out for literally trillions of dollars. And if you get if everyone's on Google from the time they're in 7 years old, they're probably going to stay on Google for the rest of their lives. So that's a big part of it. But also, an article I was just reading, and it's in our Lit review, pointed out that that Apple and Microsoft were making their money by selling the devices. Google didn't care about that. Google was all about the licensing fees for the services. Therefore, Google could afford to give everyone a great deal because, they're going to make their money forever on the monthly or yearly licensing fees.
That's very interesting. Listen, thank you. I think maybe it's time to throw it open to everyone to ask questions. Is that a good idea?
Great. Thank you,
I think Alexa's
Hugh.
going to lead that. Yes.
I'll chime in here. Thank you, Hugh. We have a couple of other special guests. In particular, we have Johan Pehrson, the Minister of Education from Sweden, with us. Johan, I'm going to add you to the spotlight right here. And we want to just give you the floor to share a little bit about, John mentioned Sweden in his presentation, but we would love to hear from you. What are you all doing about education technology in Sweden?
Thank you very much for having me and inviting me to attend this discussion. And I would also give a big thank you to Mr. Haidt for your presentation and how your work raised awareness around these important issues. And I've actually read and reviewed your latest book in a Swedish daily newspaper, and I don't have to say that I gave it quite a high rating, so to say. Well, at first my party and then now the Swedish government has started advocating using less computers in school and reducing screen time off school hours. When we started that, we were seen as very old-fashioned, as you guess. We were against the modern world, and Swedes, I say, they're afraid for one thing most of all, it's to be unmodern, to be old school, and it was also these arguments about equal access to technology, of course. So I would say now that this is not the case anymore, and I would say that today we have switched the Swedish public consensus. And now most people believe that this is a big problem. And I would say there's a quite good support for the government's agenda for reducing the screen time in school. And our policy loosely is translated to be like something like from pixel to print. It rhymes better in Swedish, but it's about reintroducing books, pencils and papers as the default tools for learning in the classroom. And it is, of course, reducing the distractions that smartphones and computers create, which you very well described. And we also allocated lots of fundings to real books and textbooks back in school. And we are taking the legislative action now to make default smart room. The default situation should be that smartphones should be banned in the schools for the whole day, because as you described this, it started off that you could just have phone-free lessons, and it was up to the teacher, etc., etc. And now we're also focusing not only to have more printed books back in the classroom, we also focus a lot on the proper staffed school libraries, which should be in all schools to give an option to read to read a book and to focus on that. So this is a journey we've started, and we also do a lot of other things to make the situation better for kids, because this is the way to focus when they are in school. But after school, we have to work with other tools to increase the chances for more kids to have a better childhood to develop in. So thank you. I'm looking forward to hear the rest of the discussion, and it was an honor to listen to you, Mr. Haidt. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Pehrson.